So good evening, friends. I'm Timothy O'Leary. Actually, I'm Timothy Fitzgerald O'Leary. Happy St. Patrick's Day, top of the evening. Welcome to our first ever installment of Let's Go There. The Washington National Opera, by the way, I'm General Director of Washington National Opera. We have a mission not only to produce beautiful performances on stage, but to connect our community and shape the future of opera. And this series called Let's Go There, we had planned just before the pandemic shutdowns in 2020. So this is our first actual outing with this series, now 2 years delayed. But the purpose is to go there, to explore the most meaningful ideas in our culture and society, the issues that are most relevant, and how the art form of opera intersects and uplifts those ideas. So we're very honored to have an extraordinary group of people tonight to explore the meaning of monuments as described in our opera, Written in Stone. So I'll introduce our moderator, whom we're very honored to work with. He's one of the most thoughtful people in the classical music business today. He began his professional career as a bassoonist, performing with groups including the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, the Louisville Symphony Orchestra, the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra, and the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. Today, he remains active in performances as a bassoonist and conductor, but he focuses also on digital content, which has included music production, the creation of nationally syndicated radio programs, a weekly podcast called Triloquy, which was noted by the New York Times as thrilling, open-minded, and omnivorous in its approach to music, one that is required listening for industry leaders and listeners alike. In addition to performing and working in digital production, Garrett offers keynotes, presentations, and guest lectures at countless schools and performing arts institutions, and he remains active in the activist and advocacy spaces, with collaborations including the American Composers Forum, the Lake Area Music Festival, the Gateways Music Festival, and the Black Opera Alliance. So please welcome Garrett McQueen.
Thank you, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. I'm Garrett McQueen. I guess that sounds a little Irish. So happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Huge thanks to everyone here at the Kennedy Center for having me. I want to offer a special shout out to Ashley Day and Jennifer Bowman for their very hard work in facilitating this event. It really has, at this point, been years in the making, and I'm honored to kick off Let's Go There with this very special event. I wanted to talk a little bit more about myself, just to help build some context around Let's Go There and the reason I believe these discussions are so important. So, as it was mentioned, I began as an orchestral bassoonist. I spent about a decade in the orchestral field, and eventually I felt like I wasn't engaging the actual dialogue that I wanted to engage as an artist. In addition to that need, that desire in me, I noticed that everyone around me, most people around me anyway, folks in the audience, and even the music that made it to a typical concert program didn't really reflect my sensibilities and my life experience. So I moved on and got into radio, public radio, and from there I've had the honor to do all sorts of really incredible things. But I really do believe in dialogue. As important as the arts are, I believe that dialogue is key in creating proximity between communities and between individuals. So it's something that I really believe in, and I can't wait to dive into today's conversation. One of the things that I also want to introduce, a concept that I always have to introduce when I have a platform, is the idea of a decolonized classical music. So when the phrase classical music is used around the world, the oral aesthetics attached to that phrase depend on the people and the culture who are being engaged. I want to live in a world where our classical music here in the United States, when we use that phrase classical music, we're really thinking about and centering aesthetics and stories, narratives, dialogues that center our people and our culture, as opposed to the Eurocentricity we've seen in the arts for generations. I just wanted to mention that. That's a different sermon for a different day, but as we engage this conversation, I hope that you'll be able to acknowledge the way that that conversation manifests in the platforming of new operas like Written in Stone. It's a really exciting time. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that this presentation is coming from the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Nacotchitana and the Piscataway, two of the many cultural communities that I hope we can all honor in every way we can while living and working here in these so-called United States. As we continue to engage the practice of land acknowledgement, I also think it's important to think about what we can do for the individuals who make up the communities that served these lands for eons. So one of the ways I want to engage more of that now in this moment is to honor a concept that I learned from indigenous people who live closer to my neck of the woods, the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe and Wapakute Sioux, a part of the country you may know as Minnesota. It's a little colder there today than it is here. I'm grateful to be here. So there's an indigenous composer named Brent Michael Davids. About 8 months ago, he introduced me to a concept that he describes as musicking. So in many indigenous languages, there isn't really a word for music or a term for music, because in many of those cultures, music isn't a thing to be shared or sold, but an action. What's centered is the purpose of the musicking. So today, my colleagues and I are going to engage a little of that as it applies to the four works that make up Written in Stone. We won't break down each of the operas themselves, but we're here to just consider the themes of these works and to apply them to the way we think about a few of the monuments that live here in the Washington, D.C. area, monuments that live here for now, at least. And with that, I would like to tell you a little bit about the first person that you're going to hear from today, in addition to myself. So I can read from here instead of turning around. So Monica O. Montgomery is the social justice curator of the Futures exhibition celebrating Smithsonian's 175th anniversary on view at Smithsonian Arts and Industries Building. She works at the nexus of equity, community, and in education by consulting as a scholar and advisor for leaders of museums, colleges, historical societies on diversity and inclusion, producing festivals and events and keynote speaking at conferences around the world, including TEDx, South by Southwest, Association of Art Museum Curators, American Alliance of Museums, Themed Entertainment Association, and more. She teaches graduate courses around museums, community engagement, and social justice at renowned institutions, including the American University, Georgetown University, Johns Hopkins, and Harvard. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Broadcast Communication from Temple and a Master's of Arts in Corporate Communication from LaSalle University. She's a professor who loves engaging everyday people in discussions around society, humanity, culture, and activism. A little more on Monica. She's independently curated over 40 justice, contemporary art, and public history exhibits with renowned organizations, including the South African Embassy, Brooklyn Museum, Portland Art Museum, Historic Germantown, T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center, Weeksville Heritage Center, Teachers College, the High Line, and more. She's been featured in the media on CBS, NBC, Fox, and C-SPAN, and including PBS as well, the Washington Post, Smithsonian Magazine, and Humans of New York, just to name a few. Everyone, I hope you'll help me introduce and welcome Monica O. Montgomery. Monica, thank you so much for joining me. This is so much, it's more fun to do this in real life than over Zoom. So
I agree. Can I say my Irish connection?
Please.
I met my husband in Dublin. It doesn't get more Irish than that. Thank you, Garrett.
Thank you so much for being here. So I want to get into monuments and monumentalism as a practice, but something that I was thinking about as I was walking around DC again, experiencing and enjoying this warm weather, is that there are monuments everywhere, but most of the ones I've seen on this trip have something in common. that they all represent white men, if I can be frank.
Indeed.
Is there a narrative? Is there any research that you can point us to that shows that that isn't the whole story of monuments in America?
Well, it's at a tipping point and things are changing, but we still have a long way to go. So I am the vice president of the board of Monument Lab, which is a renowned activist-oriented studio lab that's interrogating and critically looking at monuments around the country. We just were funded by the Mellon Foundation to do something called the National Monument Audit. So I encourage you to go to Monument Lab and check that out. And it has so many statistics about what we found across the board with monuments. Just to name a few, 50% of the top 50 individuals recorded on U.S. monuments were enslavers. 10% of the top 50 who were Black or Indigenous include Dr. King, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sacagawea, and Tecumseh. I think I'm mispronouncing that. There are more Confederate than Black American monuments in the top 50. There are no US-born Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, or self-identified LGBTQ plus persons in the top 50 monuments. And of the 6% of monuments that represent women, most of them are Joan of Arc with a few nods to Harriet Tubman. So there's a long way to go. We know that those people, while iconic, don't represent the masses of the population, and more representation is needed. And that's why we conducted this audit, because it's important before you try to remedy something that you understand the landscape and you do an assessment and you know what you're up against. And there are a lot of people that want to see new monuments spring forth. And I have a few definitions. I know you're going to ask about monumentalism, so I'll save that for that question. But these are some interesting statistics. It makes us pause. It makes us wonder. We have to think how we can elevate the next generation of those who deserve to be on monuments.
Absolutely. To help frame this conversation, even for myself, to fuel the conversation, I've offered 3 monuments here that I've had a personal connection to. The first of which being of the composer Sergei Rachmaninoff, a Russian composer who actually became an American citizen shortly before his death. So many of us also think of him as an American composer. That statue lives in World's Fair Park down in Knoxville, Tennessee. And then in the center of the screen there, it's a monument that I grew up looking at almost every day as a native of Memphis, a statue of William Bedford Forrest, who was, of course, the first Grand Wizard of the KKK. That monument, through lots of paperwork and red tape, was actually removed back in 2017, but the reverberations of that monument can very much still be felt in the city of Memphis. And then I wanted to include an image of the African Renaissance monument that lives in Senegal, this monument that tells a story of a Black strength and a Black future, although one of the narratives that we don't often hear about that monument is that it was funded by the government of North Korea. So we have these 3 examples of monuments that tell very different stories, that hold very different narratives. I wonder how in your work you have engaged the diverse nature, not only the images we see, but the diverse nature of monuments and the way that monumentalism fuels those narratives and those stories.
Certainly. So the way that I'm going to define monumentalism or monuments is a statement of power and presence in public. A statement of power and presence in public. So this is something that physically takes up space, that iconifies or reifies what we value, who we value, where we value it. Oftentimes, what we are elevating can be problematic, such as empire, war, and plunder. Sometimes, what we're elevating is thoughtful, such as commemorating genocides or wars or people that have done things to build bridges in our society and to remedy and repair. But I'm always thinking about what's the agenda behind the monument? Who put this up, right? What are the institutions that they uphold? What is the debate, or do we celebrate? And what is the perspective that this monument is taking? So whether it's bronze or marble or static or wood, there's a function, there's a form. It might be a marker, it might be a statement, but there is an agenda. And nothing is wrong with having an agenda, you just have to understand what it is. So when you're walking by something every day, how do you feel about what you're seeing? Is there a psychological safety or a psychological violence that's in play? Many people who have been I will just say, subject to the tyranny of certain monuments, Confederate, colonizer, or otherwise, have said they don't feel comfortable in certain spaces, in parks and public spaces, because those monuments don't represent them, and those visuality, that they oppressed them, right? So sometimes when we think of Christopher Columbus, many things are said. For many communities, they don't feel good about having him elevated because of the atrocities he committed. So I think we have to understand who's left at the margins, who's included, and how that monument is affecting us psychologically. And that's all part of monumentality.
Mm-hmm. It seems that the conversation of monuments has really hit light speed in these past few years. More so, maybe I shouldn't say more so, but including not only the building of monuments, but the tearing down of monuments. With contemporary history in mind, just these past few years, I wonder what you see as the path forward. Is building monuments to people or ideas something that you think should be here to stay? Should it go away? What are your ideas on that?
Well, I think we're still in this season of call-outs, right? It is shifting and taking new forms, but the dual pandemics of the fight for racial justice as well as COVID-19 have prompted a lot of people to want that public accountability. So whether it's a monument or a museum, which is the industry I'm in, or a historical society, or a corporation or a civic space, everyday people want to hold accountable those who are decision makers and who are responsible. And that is a good energy. And even if it takes the form of a hashtag or a direct action, there has to be this reckoning. So when we think of what are the heart and the feet and the words that are making people want to tear things down, want to topple monuments, that comes from a lot of small actions and millions of voices that were trying all along to advocate to get things to change. They might not have been heard. They might have been erased. The season might not have been right. But finally, that groundswell comes together, and oftentimes monuments do topple. And when we think of equity, which involves sharing power and shifting mindsets and redistributing resources, this is how equity can take form. When things are toppled and then replaced. It's not just the tear down. What are we building back up? What are we elevating? What is the new monument that our community needs, and how we can find consensus on that? That is part of the equation. And I think that institutional power systems that uphold monuments and clothe them in glory and everyone behold, here was the conqueror, we have to challenge that notion as well. Why does it have to be based on war and conquering that something should be elevated? Why can't it be soft power and peace building and community engagement? What is that about? I'd love to see some local block captains be put up on monuments. I'd love to see teachers be put up on monuments. I'd love to see the new generation of activists have monuments that represent them. So I feel like there's ways we have to shift our own mindsets and keep holding each other accountable for what we're elevating.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of elevation, I'd like to read a little bit about the next panelist that you're going to be able to hear from to elevate her. So Alicia Hall Moran is a mezzo-soprano and a composer who's currently singing the title role of Chantal in Written in Stone here at the Kennedy Center. She's the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the Ford Foundation Art for Change, the Jerome Hill Artist Fellowship, and the Van Leer Fellowship. In unique collaborations and performances spanning classical, opera, Broadway, jazz, the visual arts, literature, and contemporary dance and film, Ms. Moran has steadily engineered a pathway for her practice and classical voice over the past 3 decades, producing albums Here Today and Heavy Blue, both critically acclaimed, and inventive concert works such as Black Wall Street, The Motown Project, and Breaking Ice in the Process. A little bit more on her. Known for her no-holds-barred style of urgent art making, Miss Moran has premiered contemporary vocal works for composers and celebrated curators and artists worldwide. She also writes about music and has held artist residencies at Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, the Whitney Biennial, National Sawdust, and Yale Art Gallery. She was most recently the inaugural chamber music artist in residence for Frost School of Music at the University of Miami and a creative associate at the Juilliard School. Moran's Broadway debut was in the Tony-winning Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, everyone's favorite, right? Starring as Bess on the 20 City American Tour and earning regional awards and an NAACP Theater Award nomination. Current collaborations include new works with saxophonist Javancy Terry, new American songs with guitarist James Moore, and the continuation of her touring co-production with husband Jason Moran, Two Wings, the Music of Black America in Migration. Everyone, please help me welcome Alicia Hall Moran. Alicia, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time to be a part of this. I know you're very busy on another stage here at the Kennedy Center, but it's an honor to have you here.
Yes, we're in the Eisenhower Theater presenting Written in Stone, and at the Kennedy Center, which is itself a monument, a memorial in honor of John F. Kennedy, Jr.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and that has to be acknowledged here in this conversation, right?
We're in a monument talking about monuments, and we are invited by those put in temporary power of what happens in here. Who is engaged, what is engaged, why it's engaged, when it's engaged and developed, and when it is purposefully graceful and silent under other kinds of pressure. So I feel grateful in my my lifetime, the walking around life before the spiritual, forever to be here with you all in this moment in time. It's really very special.
Thank you. The honor is all mine. As you're mentioning, we're talking about monuments as these physical things, but I want to loop back around to some of the concepts that I was introducing earlier when it comes to land acknowledgement and even musicking. So when I think about land acknowledgement, I think about the land on which monuments live, how folks who build these monuments have to survey the land. I wonder if you can speak to that idea of surveying the land as it applies to this conversation. Why is it something important to think about or consider?
Well, for our contribution, my husband and I wrote Chantal. She is, we decided, a surveyor, and she is an up-and-coming engineer also in her profession. So I have always made all of my work, and I mentioned the works by name that I feel most represent that, which are my own albums, which I've written so much of the music for, and then also collaborated with musicians that I felt were individually monumental in their fields, in their ways, so that anything that I'm doing, I'm trying to pull in a world, not necessarily that I know that much about or am the master of, but that I want to learn about. So each invitation artistically to me is like a research project. I'm not inviting a moment of me showing my thing. I'm inviting a moment for me to do a lot of work, right? And get nervous at the point of delivery because I want to be in service to the original idea. No ideas belong to us is my idea, so my feeling. So when I say Motown, to me, this is about carving American space for us. Where can I go? What can I sell? Not give away. What can I sell? How do I get my house out of you enjoying my face, my body, my sound, my culture, my journey, my poetry, my everything, my soul, my rhythm, my boom boom, everything? But why don't I have a house? Why aren't my teeth fixed? When does that happen with my music? And so for me, I got a little excited about that. But for me, that's what Motown is about. Yeah. So we got a lot of sequins so that we didn't feel out aesthetically. But for me, it's about this, what is mine. And to me, all of what I just said is musicking. So it is carving a space for yourself that is sonic, if you're a hearing person, that is this, I don't know the word. Tactile. If you are a feeling person, that's visual, can be, if you are that kind of a seeing person. that can be experiential, as in my son, who is a dancer, because when he gets excited, you may not read it on his face all the time, or he's going to move, and it's going to be accurate to how he feels. Oh, he's a dancer. So I feel like surveying, to me, and thank you for the grace of listening to only I have long answers. Surveying, to me, the act of looking through that little scope and turning the knobs until your target is in focus, and you determine the monuments, they call them in surveying. You determine the monuments from which you will measure other points and arcs. I, the surveyor, or the lead engineer on the project, decide, woman in pink, you are monument 1, video camera, monument 2, piano 3, and lakefront 4. And then I'm going to determine, I'm cutting up the land. George Washington was a surveyor. He got a nice chunk of land, and he knows how to measure it. That's how you know when people are stealing from you, right? You're literate. He's literate in counting his land. Abraham Lincoln was a surveyor, right? And then we all work in Chicago sometimes, right? Because they like culture too, like DC. DuSable, surveyor. You're mapping your home, your homestead. You're making your place. Benjamin Banneker was an original surveyor of the two of them. The team was an original surveyor of Washington, D.C., which I didn't know when we got the commission. I learned it when I began the research to fulfill the commission. So I really want to, and then Harriet Tubman, I threw in because of celestial navigation. Also, Gladys Mae West, sister mathematician known for GPS, is in our libretto. She's like in the movie Hidden Figures, right? So this is just like Harriet Tubman. Could you walk 90 miles and know where you would end up with no phone, with no highway, with no road, like you're avoiding the road? But you can get 90 miles in a point. If you're 1 degree off, you're going to end up at the beginning of when you're setting out. You're going to be somewhere very totally different. So this is a master engineer. And I think, and so the surveying, the degrees, to me, are rhythmic divisions as well. So the musicking, vibrating through your own space, cutting up, carving up your own space for yourself, not as slave, not as sharecropper, who is basically unremunerated, how they set it up, but as your own. Daughters of the Dust, my own, my own. And that's what we want to carry. So that's what our opera is. Our opera is only as long as that answer, too. It's about 9.5 minutes.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Monica, I want to bring you back in because in the way that Alicia has created proximity between the idea of surveying and not necessarily keeping it on the physical landscapes, I think the same can apply to this concept of musicking, the idea of really centering the experience, centering what people are talking about as opposed to the art thing, the physical thing itself. I wonder what role do you see when it comes to this idea of musicking, the patron experience in the curation process? I think that it can apply even beyond music, even though it's a music word, right?
I think so. Anytime you have a visitor, an audience member, a patron, you want them to have an optimal experience, but you want to encourage meaning making. You don't want people to come, look, and leave, or come and, be passive, right? I want to talk with you all. I want you all to talk with one another. I want you all to keep vibing and come back and enjoy the arts together. Like, that is what it is about. And so when we think of musicking, I think of meaning making. Certainly in the indigenous context, I appreciate that they are using music as a tool, right? As a spiritual practice, as a cultural practice. I have some indigenous ancestry of the Catawba Nation in South Carolina. And so I'm always trying to learn more about that, about those roots and about how they celebrate and how they come together. But ultimately, if it can provoke or inspire critical thought or emotional connection or even grief, right? I'm very fascinated, and I'm teaching my students right now about being a trauma-informed practitioner, realizing that people come to the arts and they're also bringing with them different baggages and traumas from all that's happened in the world, right? From pandemic to personal loss, to seeing a person who is houseless on the street, to whatever scarcity might be happening in their lives. People are bringing that, and they come to the arts wanting catharsis, right? They come wanting to feel seen and heard, to make meaning and to understand more and contextualize their lives and the lives of others. And so whether it is, musicking or just the way that they're having a visceral reaction, I feel all of that is tangential and important. And even in the landscape of monuments, it provokes a reaction, either awe or wonder or revulsion or like, WTF, like, what is this, right? But it's the reaction that is in dialogue with the art. It's not art as a silo or art as its own kind of separate thing. The way we engage the art, the way we react to the art, the way we share about the art is just as important as the art itself.
Absolutely, and that brings us beautifully to the MLK monument that I know that we all had a reaction to when we were finally able to see it for the first time. Something that happened in my lifetime. Alicia, you introduced me to a concept behind the scenes, this idea of a visual dialogue, as it applies to this monument, the monument that MLK's monument is staring down. I want to say in perpetuity, but I guess we can't even say that necessarily. But I wonder if you can expound more on this idea of the visual dialogue and the significance of the placement of the MLK monument as it relates to the Jefferson Memorial.
Oh, yes. So that was some clever thinking, what they did with the way that this introduction to DC Monuments Mall tour kind of walks itself. Meaning even without your GPS, if you just heat seek with people and keep walking and you see something else, they let you get there, right? It looks like there's water, it looks like there's a highway. Never fear. There's a low cherry tree bough that's taking people out, even though there's a sign that says low bough. But no, it just that's something we want to have that Washington experience. So anyway, all that. We are struck. MLK seems to me, I don't know if it's exact, looking at the Jefferson Memorial. And I take this walk. I did it again yesterday because I was a little nervous to talk to you. Make sure I had this fresh in my mind. He not only looks there, if you go there, you are navigating yourself around this water body. These types of thoughts, and you're walking past the wars, you walk past Korea, you walk past Vietnam, if you know that they're there. You leave one behind you, you don't go to George Washington, you keep going towards Jefferson just because you see it. When I got to Jefferson Monument, all I'm gonna say about this is a woman was there with a group, and she said, now, let me tell you the difference between a good man and a great man. This was a great man, but he owned 300 slaves. And I thought, thank you, God, for telling me all I needed to know. And I could hear the cacophony of truck horns and car horns and police sirens and all that right at Jefferson. You can really hear it very clearly. But the scene that we enjoyed on that day felt very, very, actually even more honest. That was a real symphony happening, real 1812 going on out there. And here we were, the families, taking our little pictures and our tours all the same. The difference between a good man and a great man. MLK, I never noticed until yesterday, is pushed out from those other pillars. He pushed him, there's a quote that attaches, but I don't want to say it wrong. And left out there. And if you sing Negro spirituals, for to die, left there for to die, sent down to us for to die. And I don't even mean this in a religious way, but the way that the sculptor, the commissioned person, conceived of this for us, with those tear marks on the rock and the velocity, and shot forth, just staring at another permanent. I know they don't love that at the Monument Lab, the idea of being stuck in the permanence. No, we can move these things, we can shift. And yes, the way that they comment to one another, Vietnam, but then now they're adding names to the Korean War monument in the same way that now I know because of Written in Stone, Maya Lin, the young architect, conceived of for the Vietnam Memorial. And I have seen it before and I didn't understand it. I saw the opera many times. And I realized I had stepped into a funeral, and these people are mourning. The reflective quality, I don't just see the names and, oh, there's me. No. This is a creator who created this. That's not just happen. That's an invitation. It starts shallow, and I walk by the first names, and a very old man was in the way. And so I stopped, and he was looking at the first name. And I felt like in church when you do something not right. So I don't know to what these people come, but they all have their own relationships, and I had mine. Point is, we're having it together in some sort of agreement about what is happening here. And I don't know the difference between truck horns and that madness, ear-splitting madness, and what was going on with me and the old white man, and then the people I tripped up who were coming behind me, and then the young family, and the picture of the African-American man, and the flowers, the plastic flowers. People are still actively mourning here. And only the opera, corny as it sounds, only the opera made me take the time to think I should have the full experience of this. Opera takes a long time. It takes a long time to make. We were first written to in 2019. George Floyd was here. COVID had not happened. We are like you. So when you see what people make when it's big like this, orchestra, some of the best singers in the world on that stage, and I'm not including myself in that when I say it, then you understand the time and the reason why everything you're saying is so important about who we choose to monumentalize, because it's going to take you. 1979, Bobby Short, the pianist, has the idea, decides there needs to be a sculpture of Duke Ellington in New York City, Central Park. Great. 1979. In 1997, 99, like 20 years later, is when they have the dedication of the monument. 20 years, one jazz musician who also spends a lot of time in Paris in his life. So I think that also our experiences and our exposure. A jazz musician is supposed to put a monument of a jazz musician up in the park. Mexican-born sculptor creates it. People are very angry. There's 9 naked women under there, but these are also 9 muses, and there's that classical nod and the female body, and you don't write sophisticated lady and satin doll and in a sentimental mood if you don't know no naked body of somebody. So famously, an old man apparently turned it over in the dialogue, the community dialogue, and he said, I knew the Duke, and he would have liked those ladies. And that's the community. And it takes a lot of time.
So Monica, with the time that it takes to create some of these things, there's also the way that narratives shift, the way that our understanding of certain people shift. Again, I'm thinking about that concept specifically when it comes to the Jefferson Memorial. I'll go on record and say that I don't know if I would describe him as a great man, but once upon a time he was described as a great man. With those things considered, is anything actually ever written in stone? We can write things in stone in a physical sense. I wonder what your thoughts are on the relationship between the physical permanence and the narrative impermanence of monuments.
I think monuments are really conceptual. So the physicality of them is meant to kind of burn in your brain. This is great, this is worthy, you should look twice. But physically, no, nothing is written in stone. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. And so even though you can build something, times change, values change, society changes. And we've seen, right, in these last couple years especially, things can and do come down, and things come down unceremoniously. If there's a lot of pomp and circumstance and fanfare in the building, should you revisit 80 years later, it might come down in a very chaotic, sporadic, unceremonious way. And that's okay, because power concedes nothing without a demand. Not to just be throwing Black liberation quotes, but I'm saying, right? So I feel like there's that. I also think monuments can get added to and adjusted and reinterpreted. In the museum world, we're always talking about interpretation. So a lot of the dialogue is, what do we do with the contested monuments? Where do we put them, place them? Are they melted down and turned into something new? Are they put in a sculpture garden or a museum for safekeeping? Do we bash them and, pretend like they never existed? And I feel like there's no one right answer. There's no silver bullet. Every municipality, every group, every community has to do what feels right for them. But I do believe the word of the day is consensus, and there has to be consensus upon what needs to be moved, what needs to be replaced, what needs to be taken down, because the community needs to make sure that their values are represented. And so if something is written in stone now, it can later be changed. I also just have to say, I am someone who believes that Black lives matter. And that doesn't mean I'm subscribing to a certain organization, but the ideology that the personhood and the dignity and the identity of Black people should be free from harm and slaughter is very real. And so when I think of Trayvon, Eric Garner, Ahmaud Arbery, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and thousands more, where are their monuments? They are martyrs. They were murdered. They often don't get the justice that they deserve. They were slain due to white supremacy and fear and prejudice and oppression. And when and where will they be remembered? Because if everyone now has lawn signs in front of their house that say Black Lives Matter, and if people are putting it on social media and companies are using it to sell products, when do we monumentalize the Black lives that were extinguished and the lives that still exist? When do we celebrate the living of Black people and our personhood and the senseless slaughter that needs to stop? It makes me think of monumentality as one of the ways to remedy what is going on in society. And I feel equal parts exhausted and invigorated and anxious, but really, really ready for action and the end of just talking, the end of just saying it. When can we monumentalize those we have lost and realize that representation is what we're owed and it is our birthright, and that we shouldn't have to wait any longer for justice in that realm?
Absolutely. What you have me thinking about now is the way that we have intellectually monumentalized Martin Luther King Jr. as this man who once upon a time said, "I have a dream." But of course, he said so much more. And it's actually through his speeches and reading his writings that I learned about the Vietnam War. Of course, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is the inspiration for another one of the works and written in stone, The Rift. Monica, I want to stick with you. The Vietnam War is something that I had to go and learn about on my own. And thanks to the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's something that I have a perspective on, and dare I say, a black perspective on. I wonder if you have a similar story or a completely different story. What's your relationship with just the history of understanding what the Vietnam War was?
Well, there were several members of my family that served and fought in the Vietnam War. And I will say the way it's been socialized and that was presented to me as a child growing up is that we didn't win that war, so you don't talk about it. People came back, traumatized and messed up and substance addicted and depressed, and the VA didn't have anything for them, and many of them ended up on the streets, and even to this day, you might see some houseless people who have Vietnam vet written on the sign they're using to try to collect funds to exist. And so that is almost like the shame of America. I feel that I actually don't know what it looks like to win a war, because there's always casualty and there's always trauma and there's always going to be something that didn't go. I mean, winning a war still means there's loss, right? So, I'm an anti-war person in general, but I feel like with that war, my uncle went and came back, and when he came back, he was not himself, or he wasn't the self that he left as, and he chose to actively live on the streets. My family had a house, many properties. They would get him apartments, set him up, buy him clothes, buy him groceries. He'd say thank you. They'd check back on him in a few hours. He would just walk out the house and literally go sit on the corner and say he'd feel more comfortable there. My uncle had ulcers, and he chose ultimately to spend his final days in a shelter, dying, knowing he had ulcers and knowing he had medical assistance that could treat them, but he didn't feel at home anywhere. So whatever happened to him over there is kind of the sting of what I remember, and the shame of a nation, and the way that many black veterans especially were ill-regarded and marginalized. I can only imagine what happened, but whatever it wasn't worth it. No war is worth it, and no war ever will be.
Absolutely, I 100% agree with that. Alicia, you've heard both of us speak to the way that we have seen ourselves in some way in the history relating to the Vietnam War. You touched on this earlier, but I wonder if you can pull that thread a little more. When we visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, we can physically see ourselves in it. There's a reflection there. Does this mean that when it comes to monuments, art, opera, anything, seeing ourselves in the thing is what's required for us to actually engage the thing?
That's great what you just said. That's great. I would only add to that, when you visit the monument, even online, you sink. The plane drops on you so that the wall is 1 millimeter thick when you step. But as you walk, the wall, because you're going down, seems to be getting taller. So it subsumes you. And then as you keep walking, there's only one way out, back up toward Washington. Otherwise, you're going against the crowd. That's a powerful draw. If you make a narrow corridor, there's a lot of unspoken agreement happening. You're in a flow. You're with these people, whoever they are. You're sunken down. And that's where people spend also so much time. And then as you pull up, you feel that that's a way of musicking. It's black granite. I shouldn't say granite, because I don't really know if that's a fact. It's black. Mm-hmm. And
that's
so
what matters.
The other stuff, and it was of more recent addition. Mm-hmm. But, and from the other side, you don't see it at all. She has sunk it under some beams. It just looks like grass. From that side, you don't see anything. You got to go around the other side, and it's like, but on this side, it's like, oh, grass, pigeons, flowers, it's so nice. And that's also what we feel. I'm going to walk by and look over at Einstein with his enormous book and kids jumping over him. Mm-hmm. But over here, and so Einstein is also pulling this up. We know what Einstein was thinking, but he also managed to sell it to the world. And what does that take, Coretta Scott King? I don't know. But yet, the monument making of these men has happened, right? So, but your answer really was the best. What was your answer?
Well, I get maybe the answer was in the question, seeing oneself in a thing to engage the thing. I think just the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is a testament to that, not only literally but conceptually. We're going to shift the conversation to the piece Rise that was inspired by the portrait monument. But before we do that, we're actually lucky enough to hear an excerpt from Rise today, one titled, "Do You Know What Every Mother Wants?" Everyone, I hope you'll help me welcome soprano Raquel Gonzalez with pianist Rob Ainsley. Thank you.
Intelligence, imagination, individuality are assets to be acted on. Do you know what every mother wants? Do you know what every mother dreams for her daughter? All life, full of possibility, a home where it's safe to dream, a citizen, not a refugee, days where you're not worried about starvation or deportation. Do you know what every mother wants? Do you know what every mother dreams for her children? All life, what every mother wants is to know how things will be. Alicia, how do you say? Alicia, how will you be? Alicia, how do you say? Alicia, how will you be?
Thank you so much for that musicking, a great way to tie everything back together. So, Monica, we just got done talking about a monument with that uses very black material, black stone. And we transition now to a monument that not only uses white stone, but in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, represents some of the white centricity that surrounds the way that we think about certain things. By the time I was done with kindergarten, I knew the name Susan B. Anthony, but I was well and grown before I'd heard the name Sojourner Truth. To all of that, I wonder if you feel like there is a representation in the portrait monument in the United States Capitol Rotunda of the white centricity of the way we think about things, even women's rights.
Yes, suffrage mistakenly is seen as a white woman's movement, but I'm really excited that as we celebrate the anniversary of suffrage and many exhibits and things are brought to the fore, we see the contributions of black women in sororities, black women in civic organizations, black women in neighborhoods that marched alongside or at the back of many of these parades. There's a great exhibit at the National Archives. I believe it's called Rightfully Hers. One of my students, my exhibition students, worked on it, and many people worked on it. And it has a lot of accuracy in terms of who all was involved and the contributions that were made. And so when we think about suffrage, sometimes we think synonymously that is women's rights. It's one of the women's rights, but a lot of times women's rights in and of itself is seen as a white woman's movement, even when we think of the Women's March. And some of the visuals that come from those protests yearly, you see a large degree of white women wearing the hats, and that's fair and that's fine, but there's many identities that either want to be included or are actively erased from these conversations. I do feel that oftentimes things don't happen in a vacuum. So it's not like suffrage was here, abolition was here. There's interplay, there's parallels, everything's happening, abolition, emancipation, suffrage, all of those tensions and contradictions, and we have to focus on the breakthroughs and break down the history so we see what is happening on parallel tracks, and we honor all who were involved. And I know you want to ask me about black women leaders, because I got some answers for that. All right, I'm ready when you are.
Well, I'll give you an opportunity to do that. But Alicia, when we talk about inclusion, one of those words that so many people are throwing around these days, there has been many conversations about including a bust of Sojourner Truth in this portrait monument. There is a blank space for it. With that in mind, it would put Sojourner Truth in the back behind these women, and because of the materials that are left even, I understand that it would have to be smaller than the other busts that are depicted here. So I just wonder, in your opinion, is the inclusion of Sojourner Truth in this portrait monument, would that rehash some of the status quo, some of the racism that black women and women of color have experienced over the generations of women's rights? Is it a step backwards to put a smaller bust of Sojourner Truth behind these three women whose names we know much more than Sojourner Truth's?
I need people to know when they watch this back that that's a book and it's an idea for a book. Mm-hmm. And if you ever want to write that book or work with someone to write the foreword for the book they could write, that's a great book. I would like to read that book. My very short answer, believe it or not, but I'm giving you the credit for putting this in my mind based on this dialogue. My new answer is no. Make a proper Sojourner Truth and then pull that back out and make it look at the Sojourner Truth. Because this is the new monument building. It's the dialogue, and they have the template for it already set up. I would love to be in the middle of that glance. Yes, because it's so easy to take these conversations and make them yes or no conversations, but there's so much nuance between those two answers, and I think that plays a big role in the final opera in Written in Stone when we think about the duality of the contemplation of justice and the authority of law as these two monuments outside of the Supreme Court. Alicia, I'm going to stick with you. What can we benefit from changing the conversation from yes, no, if, or to both and, to something more nuanced? What can we benefit? What do we have to benefit from shifting our conversations toward that energy? I think that a different way of answering is to say that only with education, which shall not be hereforth limited to small children with carry-on lunches on school buses, but like them out, like y'all, them over, like everybody. Like actually, the nicer your office chair, the more required Thursdays you need at the museum, pretty much across the board. That's been what I've experienced at any given cocktail party. The interest in the titillation is high, but there's more things exciting about art and large real estate, monumentalism and tourism than just the competitive ching-ching in the smaller rooms with the more closed doors. There's also a pulse of excitement of being anywhere and knowing that you belong. The people who asked me to take their selfie, I was the only black person I saw yesterday visiting Lincoln, and I stood in the Jesse Norman, there I go, confusing my monuments. My Marian Anderson green room, which is like at his feet, and then she got the fur coat on, no, it was cold, she walked out, and then that's the stage. Please, if you have not gone there, young diva, go there and imagine 35 microphones broadcasting to every end of the earth, a message from your solar plexus and diaphragm. That's what that woman did. That performance is a monument, very well documented at the Smithsonian Museum of African American Art. And I sat in that film, and you just close your eyes, you just imagine she's singing to, you can't believe it happened. And when you go there, you can just walk there. It's steps away. You can walk there and stand on that stage. That's standing on Carnegie Hall stage. That's standing on Kennedy Center, Opera House, Eisenhower, any one of the Reach, any one of these stages. So I don't even remember your question, but that
you
is
answered it anyway.
My answer.
Monica, I want to give folks here in the audience an opportunity to talk back, ask questions or comments. So I'll ask you two questions in one. Firstly, and this may be a reach, and you can tell me if it is, but oh, that's true, yeah. So when I think about the woman presenting contemplation of justice statue and the man presenting authority of law statue, I detect a little bit of the patriarchy slipping through and being perpetuated in that way. I wonder if you can speak to that and then also offer your opinion on living monuments, some of these women who you think we should be paying more attention to and monumentalizing in many different ways.
Sure. It's definitely the gender binary at play, which is at odds with the way society is moving. And why does the man have to be the heavy and the woman has to be the soft? You know, what is that? You know, and so I feel like, again, it's the values of a bygone era that needs some freshening, some updating, some tweaking, some re-envisioning. But to the juicier question of what does it look like to monumentalize people and movements and things happening today, I feel like there's many ways we can do that work. I am always excited when I see public schools and charter schools being named after people that are still alive. I believe there are several Barack Obama schools, might even be, I believe, a Michelle Obama school, and that excites me. I'm excited to say that right now, in the city of Philadelphia, there is a Harriet Tubman statue that is on display, and it's traveling the country, and the residents were so bereft that the sculpture is set to leave at the end of March that they rallied to the city council. The city council rallied to the mayor. The mayor set aside and appropriated funds to commission another Harriet Tubman sculpture that can stay permanently. So I like to see those sorts of things. I like to see when people take to the streets and make public art or enliven spaces with creative placemaking. That's another form of monumentalizing. And I think in general, we have to see ourselves as making history every day, right? History doesn't have to be far away. It doesn't have to be white or wealthy. It doesn't have to be whatever we were taught in the textbooks, because most of that was misguided. We are making history. We can make history. We can lift one another up, and everyone in this room can and shall be worthy of a monument one day. So we have to see ourselves in that light and continue to elevate the good and crowdsource the brilliance.
Absolutely. Yeah, please.
And I think I want to say to any of my our younger viewers, maybe, it is okay for you to hear Harriet Tubman, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Sojourner Truth, because she's added names to the list. The invitation was, I heard it very clearly, for you to add names to your list. She mentioned block captain, she mentioned your teacher. If you search Monument Lab, just search, I want a monument. There are petitions already begun for things that would probably deeply move you, because these ideas are also inherited monuments in a sense. And we do not stop saying, I do not, Harriet Tubman, because I'm gonna wait until she gets her due. African Americans, and many of you may feel, no matter who you are, Ukrainian American isn't a term I was hearing very often until very quite recently. And they are here. And you see them, and they need you, but it's first, who are you? So that's like, in a very short time, the process of African Americans. We are hurting. Here's who we are. You already know us. Here's what we need. And I'm not making a political plea. I haven't the authority or the information, but just in terms of storytelling, it's the story getting invested in right now. And it's no different. We need the heroes. If you don't plant your heroes early, when you need help, you shall not get any. So we are still digging for our heroes. We're digging, not looking for them. We're digging the foundational base for them to get all they are due. And all they are due is not for us to go to events at elementary schools and anybody, anywhere says, who was that?
What I'm going to spend I want to turn it over to questions or comments from you all, but I can't not say that when you say you hadn't heard the phrase Ukrainian American until these recent years, you know, when I think about that, when I think about the context under which we say the name Harriet Tubman, what would it look like if we monumentalized people and didn't require trauma or hardship to be connected to it? What if we can celebrate people because they are great people and not necessarily people connected to some sort of trauma or bad situation? I'm gonna thank you for that. I'm gonna exactly. I'm all night in the hotel room. I'm gonna be thinking about that tonight. Yeah. So if there are, we have about 5 minutes left. If there are any questions or comments from any of you, I'd love to offer you space now.
Your thoughts, the whole panel, on how opera itself is thinking about memorializing the lives of people. And I think it gets to what Garrett was talking about with trauma-based acknowledgement of people's lives. And I'm thinking about the Emmett Till opera that has been noted in the news the last week at John Jay College, and even something like the Central Park 5 opera that Anthony Davis, composer, right. Is this a good trend that we're going toward, or just what are your thoughts on it?
This is not a trend. This is every opera about every beheaded, forlorn, murdered, trampled upon, Tosca. It's every war, Trojan coming back from, got lost at we pretend we were soldiers in the tavern, soldiers on break from the barracks, the Carmen, the gypsies, they're outlaws, here's coming the cops, they're gonna murder. It's drama. I think what the evolution of has been actually the word trauma. The idea that these aren't just people we blitz up on a day, but that they have feelings, and that we could make individual story of each of them. And so the great literature follows the literacy, follows the myth. So we need to be still, this is just my personal feeling, making our myths. But when your news is lying to you, what Tulsa massacre? What Tulsa fire? Who died? 4 people? 3 people? But he asked for, it didn't really. We're still trying to get the identification of things happening. It's, right, when we haven't time anymore. But the digging up of that story and the mourning cannot happen until it's fully told. And so I think we are in a process of retelling very young culture. We are a great, as my mother says, African Americans, probably not to exclude any other races, ethnicities, mythologies, etc., but we are the greatest, youngest thing to happen in the world. How many few 100 years of African Americans, and then ones that were not enslaved is even a shorter period. Give me 300 years to bore you in major concert houses with my Harriet Tubmans. I want 45 versions of Emmett Till. I'm reading a great book about the state now that only references him in small. Oh, we heard we're not going to go to the soda shop today because something happened with a boy. We need those plays also, where we're a distant shadow. We have statistically haven't got any with all the great ones there are and all the blood spilt and the great literature. Toni Morrison, let's get 4 operas on every book she wrote. Then, is it a trend I'm tired of? Maybe then. And the idea that we get the masterpiece the first time out of anything, I think is so unfair. And for this, I really wish that the institutions investing money in critical voices, the good writing about how to do it, when to offer it, when to withhold it, wait, and come back around when they're in Dallas, and they did it twice already. The first night, the first time, a new idea for a young people who just were learning to say the word trauma out loud. What happened to me? You're gonna pay. You won't run. You won't throw me in a pit. You won't. That just happened. Where's the? Don't even get me started. Great literature, operas, great books, films. Where are the films? Where's the whole Martin Luther King, Steven Spielberg? Then give me 4 more. Give me 5 more. Give me 6. I've seen a lot of bodies on beaches in France in films. Let's get a couple more. And when they come out, use information to digest what you think the people are trying to make. Or throw the eggs, your choice.
I'll quickly respond to that question. So as the dialogue about the Emmett Till opera continues to grow, I've learned that 10, 15 years ago, an Emmett Till opera was created with a completely black team. So why are we talking about an Emmett Till opera now? Did a white woman's libretto have to be in the room for it to be valid? That's one of the conversations I think we need to have. The other thing that I'll add, you mentioned Anthony Davis. I had the great honor of speaking with him on the Triloquy podcast, and he told me about the Malcolm X opera that he wrote in the 70s that will get a premiere at the Met, I believe, next season. A Met premiere, correct. Yeah, you're right. What will it look like for audiences who are the children of, or the people themselves who, I'm trying to watch my language, just threw rocks at Malcolm X and proverbially and didn't affirm who he was as a person through these black trauma operas? We spend a lot of time focusing in on those who have suffered trauma. What will it look like in opera spaces for us to turn the camera to those who were actually putting the trauma on black people, especially considering the kind of space that an opera space is? Those are the things I think about when I think about the way that these operas are evolving in relation to social justice, black trauma, and all of those things. Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments? Please.
Hi, my name is Princeton. I am a classically trained vocalist, and don't do that anymore. I am in tech now. But on my wall in my home, I have a picture of Marian Anderson and Leontine Price and Jesse Norman, a lot of other wonderful people, Quincy Jones, because I like to remind myself that classical music is not foreign to us. And I have to remind myself that I want to normalize that. So my question is, how do we, moving forward, continue to own our narrative there and avoid being a spectacle in art forms like opera? How do we move forward creating content for us, by us, and including others along the way versus being objectified in a way?
For me, the answer to that is the basis of my work. So when I talk about the decolonization of classical music, I'll paint this picture for you. So when we use the phrase, if you go to China and use the phrase classical music, there's an aesthetic that's instantly going to come to mind. Same for India, Japan, the African continent. I spent, back in 2013, I spent a lot of time in the Caribbean. I was teaching at the Bahamas Music Conservatory, and when you're just on the street and say the phrase classical music, I've experienced this. People are thinking about calypso. People are thinking about reggae because those aesthetics are classic to their experience. So when we think about the United States, this region of the world, what music was not imported? What music is ours? What music was created here? With the exception of music codified by indigenous people, there is no original music. There is no classical music in the United States that you can detach from the Negro spiritual. So in my opinion, when I use the phrase classical music, I'm thinking about not only the spiritual and blues and gospel, I'm thinking about jazz, I'm thinking about R&B, I'm thinking about hip hop even, because those are unique contributions from the United States in a global ecosystem of classical musics. So for me, the road forward is decolonizing that phrase, reimagining what we mean by that phrase as it applies to our history and acting as such. So does that mean that black folks can't or shouldn't perform Chopin or Beethoven? Not necessarily, but with that being said, if we put Chopin and Beethoven on the shelf, there would be plenty, we would not have a shortage of music to celebrate, and moreover, we would not have a shortage of music created by our cultures, our sensibilities, and our experiences. So for me, the road forward is recontextualizing the way we even think about the idea of classical music. Yes, I spent a decade as an orchestral bassoonist, but when I describe myself as classically trained, I'm rooting that all the way back from when I was 3 and 4 and 5 years old in the church singing gospel tunes, because that's classical music, and that's something no other people on the face of the earth have created for themselves and given to that global ecosystem of music that we all need to consider classical. And I didn't mean to have a mic drop there, but I'm very passionate about that. Any other questions or comments from anyone? Well, if there are no more questions or comments, I would just like to thank the both of you again for being here. When we think about music, we have to think about the experience, and we have to think about the dialogue connected to those experiences. I've dedicated my life not to the performance of music, not to the musicking, but to the dialogue that surrounds it. So I hope that throughout the rest of this evening and throughout the rest of your lives, you'll think about the ways in which conversations can connect communities, so that musical experiences, the musicking that we're talking about, can reflect more of who we are as a people. Thank you all very much.